Welcome to all of you. I think, as most of us know, the study of public diplomacy is traditionally focused on some of the bigger players in the international system. And basically at the Centre on Public Diplomacy, we recognise that all states of all sizes and influence level basically conduct public diplomacy of one sort or another. Now, this talk today is part of a 3-year conference speaker series that we are developing, and it basically tries to look systematically at the big powers in the international system, the middle powers, and then in the 3rd year we'll look at the smaller and even the micro states. Now, in this 1st year we decided that we'd actually have a look at the public diplomacy of the emerging great powers. And we took the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And our first lecture, and I see some familiar faces from that lecture, was on Brazil a couple of months ago by a Brazilian journalist, Paulo Sotero. Now, a research and policy question that we're addressing in this series is, how do sovereign states actually represent their real or apparent changing world status to other states and actors in the international system? And this is a very important question, not least for the United States, which really has seen its power, hard and soft, wax and wane in recent years. Now, clearly the lesson is that public diplomacy cannot be seen as a static model. It's something that is simply changing all the time, that countries have to adjust to changing domestic circumstances, changing international circumstances. So we really do need to look at dynamic models of public diplomacy in respect of a country's self-image and the way a country represents itself to the world. Now, when we considered which emerging powers we wanted to cover, India pretty much presented itself as a very obvious choice. It really did choose itself as a case study. But serendipitously, so too did the speaker. Shashi Tharoor is well known to everyone in this room. He has an absolutely stunning, stellar career, one that we can only marvel at. He has a PhD from the Fletcher School. He had a long and distinguished career at the United Nations. He reached the level of Under-Secretary General, where I saw his work at close hand in 2006. And he was also a candidate for the UN Secretary Generalship in 2006. And I can say that he and India ran an absolutely splendid, superb campaign for that particular position. He is an award-winning and a prolific author. And his most recent book, The Elephant, the Tiger and the Cell Phone, is in fact on sale outside after the talk. And I should add that this was in fact our initiative and not Shashi's. His career gets even more and more exciting in that we've been looking at the Indian press online, and we read that in fact he is in the process of being considered for a position in the Indian Parliament. So this might well be the next stage in his career, but I say nothing about this. I have no inside information. I just read the Indian press. Now, Shashi is an Indian, to be sure, but he is also one of those unique individuals that Anthony Appiah calls approvingly a global cosmopolitan. And I think his final and most notable achievement is that he is a fellow of the Centre on Public Diplomacy at USC. So, Shashi, we're absolutely delighted to welcome you back to USC and to hear you share your impressions on the public diplomacy of India as an emerging power. So, welcome.
Well, thank you very much for that. I must say that the great danger these days, of course, when you're being introduced at places like this, is people look you up on the internet and look what they find. I have to admit that I am possibly. I say possibly because there are decisions yet to be made, and I'm not the one making them. But there are. It is possible that by the end of this week, I may find myself nominated to run for a seat in the next general elections in India, which mercifully involve shorter campaigning periods than in this country. So in my home state of Kerala, votes are cast on the 16th of April, so that leaves about a month to introduce yourself to the voters and persuade them that you're the right guy for them. So we'll see. But whether that happens or not, it's a pleasure today to be here and to talk to you all about the public diplomacy of India. And, you know, in some ways, it's interesting to do this just a year after the 60th anniversary of India's independence. At midnight on the 15th of August 1947, independent India was born as our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, proclaimed in words that at least the Indians in this room have heard before, a tryst with destiny. A moment which comes but rarely in history, he said, when we pass from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance. Now, with those words, he launched India on a remarkable experiment in governance and on the world stage. Remarkable in some ways because it was happening at all. India, Winston Churchill once barked, is merely a geographical expression. It is no more a single country, Churchill said, than the equator. Well, Churchill was rarely right about India, but it's true that no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and climate, the diversity of religious and cultural practices, and the range of levels of economic development that India does. And yet, India is more than the sum of its contradictions. It's a land with its own distinctive place in the world, one which I'll try and explore with you today. Now, 10 years earlier, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of India's independence, I wrote a book called India from Midnight to the Millennium. In that, I focused on India as a country standing on the cusp of four of the most important debates facing the world at the beginning of the 21st century. And I think it's worth briefly recapitulating them simply to give you the context for India's public diplomacy as well as its own self-image in the globe of today. The four debates I identified then were the bread versus freedom debate. Can democracy literally deliver the goods in a country of poverty and scarcity? Or do its inbuilt inefficiencies simply impede rapid growth? Is the instability of political contention and of makeshift coalitions a luxury that a developing country cannot afford? India currently has a government in Delhi of 20 political parties, and it replaced an earlier government of 23 political parties. And the only thing certain about the next government that will be elected in April is that it too will be a coalition. That's pretty clear. So is that an efficient way of ensuring the well-being of the Indian masses? Or to put it bluntly, is the Chinese answer to that question of bread versus freedom the more appropriate one? Second, the centralization versus federalism debate. This, of course, is only one that occurs in large countries, but all those that Jeffrey Wiseman mentioned today, Brazil, Russia, India, China, all qualify in that category. You can add Nigeria, you can add many other countries to that category. Does a country like that need to be run by a strong central government able to transcend the divisive, the vociferous tendencies of language, caste, religion, region? Or is that government best that centralizes least? Third debate, the pluralism versus fundamentalism debate. That's a debate you're all much more familiar with around the world. Is the secularism established in India's constitution, now attacked by some in India as a westernized affectation, is that essential in a pluralist society? Or should India, like so many developing countries and like all of its own neighbors, seek refuge in asserting its own religious identity? Now, this is an issue on which I have expressed such strong views over the years in so many places that I will not belabor the point. Obviously, I'm in favor of Indian pluralism and diversity, not in favor of a narrow interpretation of Indianness, but that too goes to the heart of some of these issues, and I'll be happy to return to that during our Q&A period, if you wish, rather than belaboring it during this talk. And the fourth debate was the globalization debate, the classic, globalization versus self-reliance. It might surprise some of you, but the fact is that here in America, most people axiomatically associate capitalism with freedom, but India's nationalist leaders associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. And so the immediate suspicion of capital was that their real agenda was political. And so the Indian nationalist leaders, instead of integrating India into the global capitalist system, were convinced that the political independence they had fought so hard for could only be sustained if they also ensured India's economic independence. And so they made self-sufficiency, self-reliance, the mantra. They threw up the protectionist barriers. They took India out of the global capital system by and large, and they spent 45 years with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the Indian economy, wasting the first 4.5 decades really in regulating stagnation, subsidizing unproductivity, and trying to distribute poverty. Which only goes to show that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. Anyway, it took a major financial crisis in 1991 to prompt the country to change course. A change did occur, and a measure of the extent to which this globalization debate has turned came to me, and there are chairs at the table for those of you who are standing, so please come up, came to me just last year when I found myself addressing a large gathering in Calcutta, which is the capital of the state of West Bengal, ruled by the Communist Party Marxist, and the Communist Chief Minister of West Bengal said, some people tell me that globalization is bad for the poor and must be resisted. I tell them, he said, that this is not possible. And then he added, and even if it were possible, it would not be desirable. So when a communist chief minister speaks that way, I suspect that, that the debate about globalization is largely over. And then there's a fifth debate, which I didn't address in that book, but that was out of deference to the restraint expected by my then employers, the United Nations. And that was what economists like to call the guns versus butter debate. Or in India, you might speak of guns versus ghee. The case for expenditure on defense against spending on development. With the 21st century having begun, amidst new threats of terrorism in India and renewed talk of even nuclear warfare on the subcontinent, there's a real argument between advocates of military security, freedom from attack and terror, and those of human security, freedom from hunger and hopelessness. It's difficult to deny that without adequate defense, a country cannot develop freely according to its own lights. But it's equally impossible to deny that without development, you won't have a country worth defending. So these aren't merely academic debates. They are, in my view, the 5 most important debates of a political nature being enacted on the world stage. And the choices that India makes will resonate across the world, if for no other reason than that Indians account for 1/6 of the world's population. But all this is simply by way of background and context. In my remarks today, I won't try and do justice to all these debates, but I'd be happy to talk about them, as I said, in the Q&A. But within this broader context, I'll try and focus on India's public diplomacy in the context of the country's potential as it seeks to play a role in our globalizing world. Now, as an Indian, I have to say I'm a little concerned about those who speak of India as a future world leader or even as the next superpower. Even the subtitle to the American edition of my book was not my own. But it somehow, when the book came out, was just what the publishers thought they should talk about India as the emerging 21st century power. And many thinkers and writers that I respect have spoken of India's geostrategic advantages, its economic dynamism, its political stability, its proven military capabilities, its nuclear, space and missile programs, the entrepreneurial energy of our people, and the country's growing pool of young and skilled manpower as assuring India great power status as a world leader in the new century. Now, I have a real problem with that phrase. The notion of world leadership is a curiously archaic one. The very phrase is redolent of Kipling ballads and James Bondian adventures. What makes a country a world leader? If it's population, then India is on course to top the charts. We will overtake China as the world's most populous country by 2034. Is it military strength? Well, India's is already the world's 4th largest army. Is it nuclear capacity? Well, India's nuclear capacity was made clear in 1998, and it's now been recognized by the US through the Indo-US nuclear agreement of last year. Is it economic development? Well, there India has made extraordinary strides in recent years. It's already the world's 5th largest economy in PPP, purchasing power parity terms, and it continues to climb, though too many of our people still live destitute amidst despair and disrepair. Or could it be a combination of all of these, allied to something altogether more difficult to define, but in my view vital for public diplomacy, the power of culture? Now, all of these elements come together in a new buzzword these days, and that's the buzzword of Brand India. It's a buzzword. It's an idea, says the subtitle of a new book by a London-based author, an idea whose time has come. But what is that idea, and how does it affect India's public diplomacy? A brand, the marketing gurus tell us, is a symbol embodying all the key information about a product or a service. It could be a name, a slogan, a logo, or a graphic design. When the brand is mentioned, it carries with it a whole series of associations in the public mind, as well as expectations of how that brand will perform. The brand can be built up by skillful advertising, so that certain phrases or moods pop up the moment one thinks of the brand. But ultimately, the only real guarantee of the brand's continued worth is the actual performance of the product or service it stands for. If the brand delivers all that it promises, if it proves to be a reliable indicator of what the consumer can expect time after time, then it becomes a great asset in itself. Properly managed, the brand can increase the perceived value of a product or service in the eyes of a consumer. Badly managed, a tarnished brand can undermine the product itself. So can India be a brand? Well, a country isn't a soft drink or a cigarette, but its very name can conjure certain associations in the minds of others. This is why India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, whom I quoted already, insisted on retaining the name India for the newly independent country in the face of resistance from nativists who wanted it renamed Bharat, the old traditional name for much of the country. India had a number of associations in the eyes of the world. It was a fabled and exotic land, much sought after by travelers and traders for centuries. The jewel in the crown of Her Britannic Majesty Victoria, whose proudest title was that of Empress of India. Nehru wanted people to understand that the India he was leading was heir to that precious heritage. He wanted, in other words, to hold on to the brand, though it was not a term he was likely to have employed. Now, for a while it worked. India retained its exoticism, its bejeweled Maharajas and caparisoned elephants against a backdrop of the fabled Taj Mahal, while simultaneously striding the world's stage as a moral force for peace and justice in the vein of Mahatma Gandhi. But it couldn't last. As poverty and famine stalked the land and the exotic images became replaced in the global media with pictures of suffering and despair, the brand became soiled. It stood in many people's eyes for a mendicant with a begging bowl, a hungry and skeletal child by his side. It was no longer a brand that could attract the world. Today, the brand is changing again. As India transforms itself economically from a lumbering elephant to a bounding tiger, it needs a fresh brand image to keep up with these times. The government even set up, with the collaboration of the Business Association, the Confederation of Indian Industry, CII, an India Brand Equity Foundation. They were tasked with coming up with a slogan that encapsulated the new brand idea in time for the World Economic Forum's 2006 session in Davos, where India was the guest of honor. They did. India, fastest growing free market democracy, was emblazoned all over the Swiss resort, and Brand India was born. But though it's a great slogan, is it enough? Coca-Cola for years offered the pause that refreshes. It told you all that you need to know about the product. Does fastest growing free market democracy do the same? India's rapid economic growth is worth drawing attention to, of course, as is the fact that it's a free market. We want foreigners to invest, after all, and a democracy. That's what distinguishes us from that other place over there, which for years has grown faster than us. But isn't there more to a country than that? Now, in fairness to the smart people who coined the phrase, the more attributes you try to get in, the clunkier the phrase and the less memorable it becomes. It's easier for smaller countries that aim for one-issue branding. The Bahamas came up with a great message: it's better in the Bahamas. Puerto Rico sold itself as a tropical paradise, and there's surprising Singapore. But what do we want the world to think of when they hear the name India? Clearly, we prefer fastest growing free market democracy to replace those old images I spoke about of despair and disrepair. But surely there are other elements we want to build into this brand. The exquisite natural beauty of much of the country, encapsulated in the different Incredible India advertising campaign conducted by the tourism department. The glitz and glamour of Bollywood and Indian fashion and jewelry designs. The unparalleled diversity of our plural society, with people of every conceivable religious, linguistic, and ethnic extraction living side by side in harmony, and the richness of our cultural heritage, to name just 4 obvious examples. Yet it would be impossible to fit all that into a poster, a banner, a logo, or even a TV commercial. And we'd still have left out a host of essentials I'm going to come to, from Ayurveda to yoga to IT. So the challenge of building brand India continues. But one essential fact remains: what really matters is not the image alone, but the reality. And that reality is a pretty complex one. It's become a cliche to speak of India as a land of paradoxes. The old joke about my country is that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. Our IT experts stride confidently into the 21st century, but much of our population still seems to live in each of the other 20 centuries. Now, quite often, mind you, the opposites coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India that some of you may have seen because it zinged around the internet a few years ago is from the last Kumbh Mela, the gigantic Hindu religious festival. And it's a photograph of a naked Hindu holy man, a sadhu, right out of central casting. Okay, matted hair, scraggly beard, gap-toothed grin, necklace of beads around his neck, ash-smeared forehead, bare torso. And in this photograph, this naked holy man was chatting away on a cell phone. In fact, I loved it so much I suggested it to the publishers of my book as a perfect cover image, but they assured me it was so well known it had become a cliche in itself. And so they put another cliche on the cover, but there you are. Yet another cliche, cliches are cliches because they are true. And the paradoxes of India say something painfully real about Indian society. It's a place where bullock carts are still an indispensable mode of transportation for millions, but whose rocket and satellite programs are amongst the most advanced on Earth. And just a month ago, India became one of the handful of countries, the 4th country, I think, in the world, to successfully land a lunar probe on the moon. So that's the sort of paradox that India lives with. And the paradoxes go well beyond the nature of our entry into the 21st century. Our teeming cities overflow, while 2 out of 3 Indians still scratch a living from the soil. We've been recognized for all practical purposes as a leading nuclear power, but 600 million Indians still have no access to electricity, and we have brownouts even today in the nation's capital. Ours is a culture which elevated nonviolence to an effective moral principle, but our freedom was born in blood, and our independence still soaks in it. We're the world's leading manufacturers of generic medication for illnesses like AIDS, but we have 3 million of our own citizens with HIV who don't have access to this medication, another 2 million with TB, and tens of millions with no health center or clinic within 10 kilometers of their places of residence. India holds a world record today for the number of cell phones sold. Last month, India sold 11 million cell phones. My book, I'm ashamed to admit, is out of date because ever since I mentioned the world record India had set in April 2007 of selling 7 million cell phones that month, which was more communication, more telephone connections than any country, the US and China included, had ever established in any one month in the history of telecommunications. Since then, India has broken its world record almost every month. And last month was 11 million cell phones. January was 11 million cell phones. Unofficial figures for February say it might be 15. So India has overtaken the US as the world's 2nd largest telephone market. And it's 2nd largest because China is still larger, but it's growing a lot faster than China. But though it holds a world record for the world's largest number of cell phone sales every month, it also holds a world record for the world's largest number of farmers' suicides. 17,000 Indian farmers killed themselves last year because every time the monsoons fail and the harvest fails, the crippling mountain of debt under which they're crushed leave many of them thinking they have no way out but to take their own lives. I'll continue with the paradoxes. As you can see, the public diplomacy challenge looming there. Even though we have more dollar billionaires than any other country in Asia, more than China and even more than Japan, which has been richer longer. In fact, the nationality with the largest number of rich people in Forbes' top 10 list of the world's richest people is no longer the US. There are 4 Indians in the top 10 list, okay? But we also have 260 million Indians who live below the poverty line. And this is not the UN or World Bank poverty line of $1 a day, now revised by the bank to $1.25 a day. It's the Indian poverty line, which is calculated in rupees, differently for rural and urban India. And in rural India, it's 360 rupees a month, or less than 30 cents a day. So it's a poverty line drawn just this side of the funeral pyre. and there are people living above that poverty line whom anybody in the world would consider poor. We've trained world-class scientists and engineers, many of whom dominate Silicon Valley just up the road from here, but 400 million of our compatriots are illiterate, and we have more children in India who have never seen the inside of a school than any country has. We have a great demographic advantage in theory in 540 million young people today in India under the age of 25, which means we should have a dynamic, productive, youthful workforce for the next 40 years when the rest of the world, including China, is aging. But we also have 60 million child laborers, and 72% of the kids in our government schools drop out before the 8th grade. We celebrate India's IT triumphs, but information technology has employed a grand total of 5 million people, while 10 million are entering the workforce each year, and we certainly don't have IT jobs for them. Many of our urban youth say with confidence, and rightly, that their future is brighter than their parents' past, but there are Maoist insurgencies violently disturbing the peace in 165 of India's 602 districts, and these are largely made up of unemployed young men. So yes, we are a land of paradoxes, and amongst these paradoxes is that so many of us and so many foreigners speak of India as a great power of the 21st century when we are not yet able to feed, educate, and employ our people. And yet, as I said at the very beginning, India is more than the sum of its contradictions. It may be a country rife with poverty and pestilence, but it nonetheless moved the Mughal emperor to declaim, "If on earth there be paradise of bliss, it is this, it is this, it is this." We just have a lot more to do before it can be anything like paradise for the vast majority of our fellow citizens. So given all these paradoxes, you will have gathered that it's not economic growth, military strength, or population numbers that I would underscore when I think of India's public diplomacy role in the world of the 21st century. Rather, there's one attribute of independent India on which I think we can focus today, and to which increasing attention should now be paid around the globe. It's the quality which India is already beginning to display in ample measure today, and that is its soft power. Now, the notion of soft power is, as you know, relatively new in international discourse. The term was coined by Harvard's Joseph Nye to describe the extraordinary strengths of the US, really, that went well beyond American military dominance. As Nye explained it, power is the ability to get others to do what you want them to do, and there are 3 ways you can accomplish this. You can use coercion, sticks, you can use incentives, bribes, aid, carrots, or you can use attraction, the power of attraction, and that's soft power. And it goes to the assumption that, of course, traditionally, power in the world has been seen in terms of military power. The side with a larger army was always likely to win. But by the time that Nye started analyzing it, the last couple of decades of the 20th century, that was no longer accurate, right? The Soviets lost the war in Afghanistan, America lost the war in Vietnam, and certainly in the first few years of the war in Iraq, I think America learned the wisdom of Talleyrand's old adage that the one thing you cannot do with a bayonet is to sit on it. So hard power has real limitations. And that's where soft power came in, both as an alternative to hard power and as a complement to it. And if I can quote Nye briefly, quote, "The soft power of a country rests primarily on 3 resources: its culture, in places where it's attractive to others; its political values, when it lives up to them at home and abroad; and its foreign policies, when they're seen as legitimate and having moral authority," unquote. I'd actually go slightly beyond Nye's description. A country's soft power, to me, emerges also from the world's perceptions of what that country is all about. The associations and attitudes conjured up in the global imagination by the mere mention of a country's name is often a more accurate gauge of its soft power than a dispassionate analysis of its foreign policies. In my view, hard power is exercised, soft power is evoked. Now, for Nye, of course, in his initial thesis, the US is, or was in those days, the archetypal exponent of soft power. The fact is, we all know the US is the home of Boeing and Intel, of Google and the iPod, Microsoft and MTV, Hollywood and Disneyland, McDonald's and Starbucks, in short, of most of the major products that dominate daily life around our globe. the attractiveness of these assets and of the American lifestyle of which they're emblematic is that they permit the US to maximize its capacity to attract people to America, the American way of life, the American agenda, rather than relying purely on the dissuasive or coercive hard power of military force. Now, in a world of instant mass communications enabled by the internet, countries are increasingly judged, it seems to me, by a global public fed on an incessant diet of internet news, televised images, videos taken on the cell phones of passers-by, email gossip. And so soft power gets complicated by all of that. The steep decline in America's image and standing after 9/11 was a direct reflection of the global distaste for the instruments of American hard power. The Iraq invasion, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, torture, rendition, Blackwater's killings of Iraqi civilians, and so on. But we're not here to talk about the US. I just wanted to lay that out. Nye himself, in his book, The Paradox of American Power, took the analysis of soft power beyond the US, and he talked about how other nations could also acquire it. And, you know, it's true that way back in 1870, when the French got clobbered by the Prussians in war, their first reaction as they sort of began to rebuild the nation's shattered morale was to establish the Alliance Française, so that the promotion of French culture could in itself be an asset for France and obviously an indispensable tool of its public diplomacy, even if it didn't have the phrase in those days. Similarly, you know, the UK has a British Council, the Swiss are pro-Helvetia, Germany, Spain, Italy, and Portugal have institutes named for Goethe, Cervantes, Dante Alighieri, and Camus, and now the Chinese have started establishing Confucius Institutes to promote Chinese culture internationally. And of course, the Beijing Olympics have been a sustained exercise in the building up of soft power by an authoritarian state. So the Olympics as an instrument of public diplomacy are also now a new element in all of this. Now, the US itself has used officially sponsored initiatives from Jeff Cohen's Voice of America to the Fulbright scholarships to promote its soft power around the world. But despite my great respect for Jeff, I would argue that soft power doesn't merely rest on governmental action. Because for the US, one could argue that for all its good efforts, Hollywood and MTV have done more to promote the idea of America as a desirable and admirable society than any US governmental endeavor, even the Voice of America. Soft power, in other words, is created partly by governments and partly despite governments, partly by deliberate action, partly by accident. So what does this mean for India? Well, obviously it means giving attention, encouragement, and support to the aspects and products of Indian society that the world would find attractive. Not, I think, in order directly to persuade others to support India as such in the Nye formula, but rather to simply enhance India's intangible standing in the eyes of the world. India's public diplomacy must be anchored in the world's perception of the kind of country it is. And that's my thesis for what it's worth. India's is a civilization that over millennia has offered refuge and more important, religious and cultural freedom to Jews, Parsis, several varieties of Christians, and Muslims. Jews came to India centuries before Christ with the destruction by the Babylonians of their first temple. And to this day, it's the only example of a Jewish diaspora that did not know a single instance of anti-Semitism in its entire history in India until the Portuguese showed up in the 16th century to inflict it. But certainly no instance of any Indian community, Indian Muslims included, creating a single instance of anti-Semitism or any attacks on the Jewish community. Christianity arrived on Indian soil with St. Thomas the Apostle, good old doubting Thomas, who came to the Kerala coast sometime before 52 AD, and as legend has it, was welcomed on shore by a flute-playing Jewish girl. He made many converts, so there are Indians today whose ancestors were Christian well before anybody of European ancestry had discovered Christianity up their family tree. In Kerala, where Islam came through traders, travelers, and missionaries rather than by the sword, the welcome was so remarkable that the Zamorin of Calicut, the ruler of one of the local states in that area, was so impressed by the seafaring skills of the Muslim community that he issued a decree obliging each fisherman's family to bring up one child as a Muslim, because he was convinced only Muslims could sail properly. This is India. The neighborhood where I lived in my high school years in Calcutta was a place where you could routinely hear daily the wail of the muezzin calling the Islamic faithful to prayer, which blended routinely with the chant of mantras at the Hindu Shiva temple at the corner, and the tinkling of church bells accompanied the Sikh Gurudwara's reading on a loudspeaker of verses from the Guru Granth Sahib. That is the India that I think has a huge advantage in public diplomacy, because that is the reality of India. The British historian E.P. Thompson wrote, and I quote here, "India is perhaps the most important country for the future of the world, because," he said, "all the convergent influences of the world run through this society. There is not a thought that is being thought," Thompson said, "in the West or the East that is not active in some Indian mind." I'm glad a Brit said that and not an Indian. But that Indian mind has been shaped by remarkably diverse forces: ancient Hindu tradition, myth and scripture, the impact of Islam and Christianity, and 2 centuries of British colonial rule. The result is unique. Though there are some who think and speak of India as a Hindu country, Indian civilization is actually an evolved hybrid. In the breadth of its cultural heritage lies a great deal of India's soft power. Now, one of the few generalizations that can safely be made about India is that nothing can be taken for granted about the country. Not even its name. For the name India comes from the river Indus, which flows in Pakistan. Well, that's easily explained, of course, because what is today Pakistan was part of India until it was hacked from the stooped shoulders of India by the departing British. But the fact is that Indian nationalism in many ways reminds me of the apocryphal argument between an American and a French diplomat at the Security Council, where the American diplomat, talking about a particular problem, says, "You know how we can solve this? We can do this and this and this, and we can solve it." And the French diplomat says, "Yes, that will work in practice, but will it work in theory?" Does that sound like Professor Castells or no? But anyway, the fact is Indian nationalism works in practice, but it doesn't work in any of the theories of what makes a nation. It's not based on language, since we have at least 23 different languages spoken in India, 35 spoken by more than 1 million people each, and 22,000 dialects. It's not based on geography, because the natural geography of the subcontinent, framed by the Himalayas and the sea, was also hacked by the partition of 1947. It's not based on ethnicity, not just because the Indian accommodates a diversity of ethnic types and racial types, if you want to call it that, but there are also the fact that there are Indians who have ethnically more in common with foreigners than with other Indians. An Indian Punjabi or an Indian Bengali is ethnically kin to a Pakistani or a Bangladeshi rather than to a Poonawala or a Bangalorean. And the idea of India is not based on religion. We are home to every faith known to mankind, with the possible exception of Shintoism. And Hinduism, a faith without a national organization, no established church or ecclesiastical hierarchy, no Hindu pope, no Hindu Mecca, no uniform beliefs or modes of worship, not even a Hindu Sunday, is a religion that as much exemplifies our diversity as it does our common cultural heritage. So Indian nationalism is in fact the nationalism of an idea. The idea, if I can borrow from Peter Pan, of an ever land, emerging from an ancient civilization, united by a shared history, and sustained by a pluralist democracy. Pluralism is a reality that emerges from the very nature of the country. It's a choice made inevitable by India's geography and reaffirmed by its history. And the result is that we are all minorities in India. It's a land that imposes no narrow conformities on its citizens. It says you can be many things and one thing. You can be a good Muslim, a good Keralite, and a good Indian all at once. So the idea of India is that a nation may endure differences of caste, creed, color, culture, cuisine, conviction, custom and costume, and still rally around a consensus. And that consensus is around a very simple democratic principle, that in a large and rich, diverse democracy like India, you don't really need to agree all the time, so long as you agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. Part of the reason that India has survived, and I think part of the reason for India's being respected in the world, is that all the stresses and strains that exist in the country, and that even led so many learned American political scientists to predict its imminent disintegration back in the 50s and 60s, is that it managed to maintain consensus on how to manage without consensus. I think the world of the 21st century will increasingly be a world in which the use of hard power carries with it the odium of mass global public disapproval. Whereas the blossoming of soft power, which lends itself much more easily to the information era, will more and more constitute a country's principal asset. Soft power is not about conquering others, but about being yourself, and what you are being something that's attractive and admirable. Increasingly, countries are judged by the soft power elements they project onto the global consciousness, either deliberately through the export of cultural products, the cultivation of foreign publics, or even international propaganda, or unwittingly through the ways in which they are perceived as a result of news stories about them in the global mass media. So conventional diplomacy clearly is not enough. There's an old saw about Indian diplomacy. It goes back a long while. I first heard it as a student strolling the corridors of the Ministry of External Affairs from an already retired diplomat who said, you know, young man, he said, Indian diplomacy is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It's conducted, he said, at a high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, that's a lot less true today, I'm happy to say. But the best kind of public diplomacy is that which does not rely on professional diplomats to conduct it. Take, for instance, the impact of Indian culture abroad. Notably, since we're in the city of the Oscars, notably that of Bollywood, right, which has just managed to come again into the public consciousness with Slumdog Millionaire's Oscars. Now, as a writer, I have to confess, my attitude to Bollywood tends to be best summarized in the tale of the two goats at a Bollywood garbage dump who are chewing away on cans of celluloid discarded by a Bollywood studio. And the first goat chewing at the celluloid says, you know, this film's not bad. And the second goat says, no, the book was better. And the fact is, the book is always better. But still, Bollywood is now bringing its brand of glitzy entertainment not just to the Indian diaspora in the US or the UK, but to screens of people around the world, to screens of Arabs and Africans, of Senegalese and Syrians. I met a Senegalese friend in New York who told me that his illiterate mother takes a bus once a month from her village to the capital city of Senegal, Dakar, just to watch a Bollywood movie. She can't understand the dialogue. She's illiterate, so she can't read the French subtitles. But these movies are made to be understood despite such handicaps. And she enjoys the song and the dance and the action and the romance and the mood, and she leaves with stars in her eyes about India as a result. Different example, an Indian diplomat friend posted in Syria about 10 years ago, told me that the only publicly displayed portraits in Damascus, as large as those of the then President Hafez al-Assad, were portraits of the Indian Bollywood superstar Amitabh Bachchan. Now, that's the way in which India is able to capture the global imagination. Indian art, classical music, dance have the same effect. So does the work of Indian fashion designers striding across the world's catwalks, and which are usually a lot more comfortable than this thing that the West invented to strangulate the male. Indian cuisine, which is spreading around the world, has also raised our culture higher in people's reckoning. As the French have long known, the way to foreigners' hearts is through their palates, to the point where today in England, Indian restaurants, or curry houses as the Brits call them, employ more people than the iron and steel, coal mining and shipbuilding industries combined. So the empire can strike back. Yet the irony is that many Indians still fear that all this globalization is going to bring with it cultural imperialism of a particularly insidious kind, that Baywatch and burgers will supplant Bharatnatyam dances and Bhelpuri snacks. I disagree, and I think that India's experience with the liberalization of its economy and with Western consumer products has now conclusively demonstrated that we can drink Coca-Cola without becoming Coca-Colonized. Indians will not become any less Indian if, in Mahatma Gandhi's famous metaphor, we open the doors and windows of our country and let foreign winds blow through our house. Because we're strong enough to stay on our own 2 feet. Our popular culture has proved resilient enough to compete successfully with MTV and McDonald's, and India has become a player in globalization, not merely a subject of it. So India benefits from the future and from the past. From the appeal of its traditional practices, look at the popularity of yoga around this country, or the increasing popularity now of Ayurveda. The transformed image of India created by its thriving diaspora is also a factor in India's soft power. Information technology, IT, has made a serious contribution to this. Because when Americans, at least in Silicon Valley and related places, speak of the Indian Institutes of Technology, the IITs, with the same reverence that they used to accord to MIT, and the Indianness of an engineer or a software developer is almost always taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence, then of course it's India that gains in respect. Now sometimes this has unintended consequences. I met an Indian friend the other day who, like me, was a history major. He was transiting through Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam and found himself accosted by an anxiously perspiring European saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" I mean, the old stereotype of Indians was that of snake charmers and fakirs lying on beds of nails. Now the stereotype is every Indian must be a software guru or a computer geek. But you see, in the information age, as Joseph Nye has argued, it's the side with the better story that wins. India can and must remain the land of the better story. As a society with a free press and a thriving mass media, where the people whose creative energies are daily encouraged to express themselves in a variety of appealing ways, India has an extraordinary ability to tell stories that are more persuasive and attractive than those of its rivals. Now, this is not about propaganda. Indeed, it will not work if it's directed from above, least of all by the government. But its impact, though intangible, can be huge. To take one more example, Afghanistan is clearly a crucial country for your national security. We've seen what President Obama has done in terms of announcing an increase in troops there and so on. It's also a greatly important place for India's national security. Our embassy in Kabul was bombed by a Pakistani-directed suicide bomber just last July. So it's a huge problem as a national security issue, but the most interesting asset for India in Afghanistan is not a military mission. It doesn't have one. It is, in fact, this simple fact. Don't try and telephone an Afghan at 8:30 in the evening. Why? Because that is the moment at which the Indian television soap opera Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi, dubbed into Dari, is telecast on Tolo TV, and no Afghan wants to miss it. I mean, inasmuch as there were unscientific audience measurements, the one that I saw was 92% of Afghan televisions were tuned to the show at 8:30. It was considered singularly responsible for a spike in the sale of generator sets because people didn't want brownouts during its telecast times. It has been blamed by mullahs for absences from religious functions at that time. There have been stories of wedding banquets being interrupted for half an hour so guests could huddle around the TV and then turn their attention to the bride and groom. And it's simply because in a very conservative Islamic society where family problems are literally hidden behind the veil, an Indian TV show became the excuse and the reason for an open discussion of family problems. And this is essentially what explains it. We've now heard that there's been an increase in crime in Afghanistan at 8:30 p.m. because watchmen are busy looking at the TV rather than minding the store. One Reuters dispatch, so this is not an Indian journalist but a British news agency, last summer recounted how robbers in the town of Mazar-e-Sharif stripped a vehicle of its wheels, its mirrors, its hubcaps, its spokes, its windshield wipers, every movable part, and then scrawled on the windshield in an allusion to the soap opera's heroine Tulsi, Tulsi Zindabad, which means long live Tulsi. I mean, that is soft power. And you know, we can call it public diplomacy, though the government had nothing to do with it. But in some ways, it is the most effective aspect of public diplomacy. Of course, official government policy can also play a role, and the current head of the Indian Council on Cultural Relations, is a friend of mine, has actually gone so far as to argue that culturally India is a superpower and that cultural diplomacy must be pursued for political ends. So India is highly visible at cultural shows around the world, and the ICCR, the Indian Council on Cultural Relations, is rather good at organizing festivals of India in assorted foreign cities. But as I said earlier, I'm not a fan of propaganda, which most people tend to see for what it is. I believe the message that really gets through is of who we are, not what we want to show. So, because soft power is not just what we can consciously and deliberately exhibit or put on display. That's what official government propaganda does. It's rather how others see what we are, whether or not we're trying to show it to the world. So to take a different example, we talked about the elections coming up in India in a month's time, but the previous elections 5 years ago saw something that was a huge public diplomacy asset for India, because at the end of those elections we found that the election had been won by a woman political leader of Catholic faith and Italian descent, Sonia Gandhi, who then made way for a Sikh, Manmohan Singh, to be sworn in as Prime Minister by a Muslim president, President Abdul Kalam, in a country 81% Hindu. We've all celebrated Barack Obama's election in this country last November, but that only reminds us that for 220 years before that, the world's oldest democracy hadn't yet managed to elect a president or a vice president who was anything but white, male, and Christian. And here you've got all of these things and more being dealt with in one Indian election. And this sort of management of diversity through this extraordinary range of opportunities to people of every conceivable background, that is something that makes India very special. And I know about the public diplomacy advantages to India of that because I happened to be traveling in the Arabian Gulf at that time. And the reaction of the senior Arab officials I met, even though I wasn't representing India, I was there for the UN, had to be seen by any Indian diplomat as a huge asset for the way in which the country was perceived merely as a result of something seen in the news about it. So it's not just material accomplishments that enhance soft power, that enhance a country's standing in the world. Even more important are the values and principles for which a country stands. In India's case, Mahatma Gandhi won us our independence through the use of soft power, because non-violence and satyagraha were indeed classic uses of soft power before the term was even coined. But in a tough neighborhood, the apostle of peace can only take you so far. Soft power becomes credible when there is hard power behind it. That's why the US has been able to make so much of its soft power. India has to know that soft power alone cannot solve all its security challenges. An Islamist terrorist who enjoys a Bollywood movie will still have no compunction about setting off a bomb in a Delhi market or taking hostages in a Bombay hotel. And the US has already learned that the perpetrators of 9/11 ate their last meal in a McDonald's. So to counter a threat like terrorism, there is still no substitute for hard power. Hard power without soft power stirs up resentments and enmities, as we said earlier. But soft power without hard power becomes a confession of weakness. Where soft power works is in attracting enough goodwill from ordinary people to reduce the sources of support and succor that the terrorists can enjoy, and without which they cannot function. So when I speak of the way in which India is perceived around the globe, it also means that India needs to solve its internal challenges. It has to do enough to keep its people healthy, well-fed, and secure, not just from jihadi terror, but from the daily terror of poverty, hunger, ill health. Progress is being made. We can take satisfaction from all sorts of dramatic transformations in India, including the economic growth rate you've all heard about, but we have to ensure that if our soft power isn't a ring hollow, that these benefits reach the large numbers of people, a third of our people living in horrendous conditions, as I mentioned earlier. At the same time, of course, it must preserve the precious pluralism that is such a civilizational asset in our globalizing world. And our democracy, our thriving free media, our contentious civil society forums, our energetic human rights groups, and the repeated spectacle of our remarkable general elections. Every time they take place, they are the largest single exercise in democratic franchise in the history of the planet. Last time there were 675 million registered voters. This time there are 714 million registered voters. And a good more than 60% of them will show up and vote too. I mean, it's an extraordinary sight. It adds to India's soft power when its non-governmental organizations actively defend human rights, promote environmentalism, fight injustice. And of course, it's an asset that the Indian press is free, lively, irreverent, and disdainful of sacred cows. But every time there are reports of something different, of sectarian violence or inter-religious attacks in India, or even at a more petty level, a nativist attack like those by a fringe group in February on women drinking at a pub in South India. When these things happen, of course, India suffers a huge setback to its soft power. Soft power will not come from a narrow or restricted version of Indianness, confined to the sectarian prejudices of self-appointed guardians of Indian culture. It must instead proudly reflect the multi-religious identities of our people, our linguistic diversity, the myriad manifestations of our creative energies. That will be India's true heritage in the eyes of the world. And that does mean acknowledging the great importance in wielding soft power of defending, asserting, and promoting a culture of openness, which is very much India's default mode, against the forces of intolerance and bigotry inside and outside the country. It helps, of course, that India is anything but the unchanging land of timeless cliché. There's, in fact, a tremendous degree of change and ferment taking place in our democracy. And we're seeing this, again, as a soft power asset. For example, everyone's heard about the caste system for thousands of years, untouchability, all of that. Today, as a result of the democratic process, our largest single state, the state of Uttar Pradesh, a population of 200 million people, is ruled as a result of free and fair elections by an untouchable woman, a Dalit woman of this formerly untouchable community. Something that would have been inconceivable for 3,000 years. And she built her own rainbow coalition and came to power. It's still true that in many parts of our democracy, when you cast your vote, you vote your caste. But that's also meant that the people at the bottom of the caste ladder have been able to use their power of numbers at the ballot box to advance themselves in the world. All of these changes have meant that we have a democratic revolution taking place in India, sustained by a larger idea of India, an idea that safeguards the common space available to each identity, an India that celebrates diversity. If America is a melting pot, well, I have to confess we probably are not. What we are in India is a thali. And how many of you have been to Indian restaurants? A thali is a large stainless steel plate with a number of sumptuous dishes in different bowls sitting on that plate. Now, since they're each in a different dish, they each taste different, they don't necessarily flow into the next, but they belong together on the same plate and they combine on your palate to give you a satisfying meal. That's, to me, a metaphor for the way in which the world has a whole lot to go, and India is an extraordinary exemplar of that kind of ethos. So I believe, therefore, that in speaking of all this business of world leadership, in our globalizing world, the India that's entered its 7th decade as an independent country is and must be one that's open to the contention of ideas and interests within it, that's unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, that's wedded to the democratic pluralism, which is India's greatest strength, and that's determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies of its people.
Clayton Powell.
Point of information, is the text of that going to be available on the website?
We've been talking, it's sort of a work in progress. My thinking continues to evolve, but yes, I think Jeff is working out something to
So,
get.
Professor, sorry, Adam.
That was a bit off topic, but
I have to admit that most of my ad-libs are not written down anywhere, so you'll have to...
you were writing it.
And your video, this video.
Ah, well, there you are.
I want to ask about something you said in passing a couple of times. First, of moral authority. Last month, there were several events around India, the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's travel to India to study the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi, and then come back and help spearhead the March on Washington here. It's also the 55th anniversary of the meeting of non-aligned nations in Bali, Indonesia, which was organized by that moral authority, non-violence, not being east or west. Do you think that's something which is dated in the 1950s and is now inconsistent with what's happening in this tough neighborhood, as you call it?
I'm afraid so. I mean, I think what happened in the 50s was India did carve out a space for itself, as you so correctly described, as a moral voice in the world. But unfortunately, two things went wrong. First, India became little too much a country that was perceived by others as sort of conducting foreign policy as a kind of moralistic running commentary on the conduct of others, which is not something that endears you to people too much. And the second thing is the gap between India's sort of enunciation of values and principles and its own ability to fight its own corner became too glaring. The first was the humiliating defeat in a short and brutal war with China in 1962, which sort of, made all the talk about peace and ahimsa and Gandhi and so on look hollow. And then there was the continuing failure to grapple with the challenges of poverty and development, the dependence on foreign aid in those days, which again, I think discredited to some degree India's authority to stand and preach if it couldn't take care of itself to begin with. What's different today is, first of all, India has built up a hard power capacity it didn't have before. It's no longer likely to be lightly clobbered even by China if it came to that, or by anybody else in a military sense. Secondly, it preaches a lot less and does more about attending to its own problems, and its success in overcoming its own problems has given it a different sort of credibility. But a third complication is that in the process of this change, India has also, unfortunately, become a little more cynical and world-weary in its view of the world. I mean, I wrote a piece some time ago about Indian foreign policy in relation to Myanmar, Burma, because India's classic approach, and I'm sorry, I apologize for the people who were taping that. India's classic approach had been very much the moralistic one. When the Burmese junta rejected the results of the free and fair elections of 1990 and arrested Aung San Suu Kyi and the student leaders, and some fled, India was the only country in the world that gave them not just moral but practical support, gave refuge to the students, allowed them and probably financed them to set up a newspaper, a radio station, etc., gave them moral support to fight for democracy. And the result, as India discovered, was that it lost a huge amount of ground in its own backyard. The junta continued merrily on. China and Pakistan exploited the space in Burma that India had vacated. The Burmese, with the support of China and Pakistan, began arming rebels to go into India's northeast from across the Burmese border. And people within the Indian political space began asking, so what have you gained for your support of Burmese Democrats? A moralistic foreign policy is all very well, but in your own backyard you've got to be more realistic. And sure enough, all it took finally was a visit to Burma by General Musharraf of Pakistan, and the Indian foreign minister followed suit very quickly after, and India changed its policy completely into a much more cynical one. And now India makes a virtue of it, saying, we are now focused on foreign policy in a more hard-headed way. And that does mean, unfortunately, that a number of moral issues where India would have in the past taken a purely moralistic position, it tempers that position with other political considerations in relation to its geopolitical drive in many countries. And so I think for India today to be a voice for a purely moral foreign policy would no longer have the credibility it had in the days of Gandhi and Nehru in the 50s and early 60s. The world has changed. In any case, the era of Bandung is behind us because there's no longer two contending superpower blocks to be non-aligned between. The time has now come, I think, for every country to look out for number one a little more, and India is sadly no exception to that. But as I said in writing about Burma, I said, well, India may have voted with its head rather than its heart, but in the process it's done some damage to its soul.
Professor Castells.
Shashi, although I generally agree with your depiction of the tolerant culture of India, how do you place in that tolerance major facts such as the mass killings and atrocious riots between Muslims and Hindus, mass killings in Gujarat, for instance, or the confrontation with the Sikh? And also, I think probably, you will correct me because you know better, but I think Hindu nationalism and even fundamentalist nationalism, it's very strong in India, or has been strong until recently, because the nucleus of the BJP party, the RSS, were clearly ethnic nationalists. And they have now disappeared, and they are in key positions in Indian politics. So, in contrast to this image, which I agree that is the dominant trend, fortunately, there are all kinds of shady zones in India that are extremely dangerous, particularly in the possibility of a confrontation with Pakistan that would exacerbate nationalism and religious confrontation. How do you deal with that?
Oh, I agree with you, Manuel. And as I say at the blackjack tables, I purchased insurance by saying everything I tell you about India, the opposite is also true. And the truth is that the truth is that there is. I mean, I have written extensively and vigorously against the forces of intolerance and bigotry in my country. What is interesting, though, is that despite the fact that Hindus are 81% of the population, a Hindu chauvinist, I don't use the word Hindu nationalism because Hindus are not a nation, they're a religious group, and they're not an ethnicity either. They're
Hindu fundamentalism,
but, well, no, because Hinduism is uniquely a religion without fundamentals. So you can't be a Hindu fundamentalist. Hinduism basically says you can believe pretty much anything and be a Hindu. So you can't reduce Hinduism to a Semitic creed where there are 10 commandments or one holy book or whatever. We have dozens of holy books, lots and lots of views of creation. Our basic assumption about the Godhead is that it's unknowable. Divinity is something human beings can only aspire to but never actually touch. And even creation, there's a wonderful creation verse in our oldest holy book, the Rig Veda, which says, from where did all this come? From whence was the world made? Only he in the heavens knows, or maybe he does not know. I mean, that skepticism is built right into the heart of the Hindu faith. So Hindu fundamentalism is itself a contradiction in terms. There's nothing more profoundly un-Hindu than the Hindutva movement, the Hindu chauvinist, Hindu extremist, Hindu fanatic movement, and that's the arguments of people like myself. But what's striking to me about all of this is that despite being 81% of the population, they've never gathered more than 25% of the vote at any election. The peak they've ever got is 25%, and it's gone down 23 in the last elections. And in our system, because, as I mentioned earlier, every government is a coalition government in India for the foreseeable future, it is inconceivable that even if the BJP came to be in power through a coalition, it's inconceivable that that particular chauvinist view could ever become dominant. Because, for example, when they did lead a government of 23 parties, there was only one other party in the 23 that shared their intolerant agenda, and they were not able to pursue policies of intolerance because in power they had to be responsible and bring the rest of the country along with them. So that's why I'm not as worried about that as you do. But at the same time, you're right, when violence occurs, when people are killed, when homes are, oh yes, in large numbers, frequently, that has to be fought and resisted. And it is an aberration still. I mean, the fact is, in a country of 1.3 billion people, the sad thing is when 1,000 people are killed, it is like, I'm afraid, 10 people dying in an accident in America. But the truth of the matter is it's obviously unacceptable. It's 1,000 lives, and it's a rending at the heart of the fabric of Indian society. What's wonderful is that Indians are amongst the loudest voices raised against it. And my hope is that the current that I've described both currents, but the current that I stand for and that still remains, in my view, the prevailing ethos of India since millennia will prevail. But in some ways, the fact that it's being challenged by the forces you describe makes it that much more worthwhile to fight for and defend it. And you know, you talked about the Sikh insurgency. The Sikh terrorist movement was never supported by more than, God knows, at a random guess, 10% of the Sikh population. In fact, most of the police and the military who put the Sikh insurrections down were themselves Sikh. And of course, we have a Sikh prime minister now, as we had a Sikh president at that time. Christians, this was very, very much an aberration. What happened in Orissa, the attacks on Christians, it was partly tied up with an intertribal conflict as well, between a tribal group that had converted to Christianity and another one that had not, fighting for the spoils. But I'm not excusing any of it. All of this is indefensible. I have condemned it as loudly and strongly as you can. But I'm just saying these should not be seen somehow in a country like India as representing the dominant ethos. It reminds me of the time when in the city of Surat, there were 2 cases of plague, and the State Department immediately issued an advisory that people should not travel to India because there was plague in India. I mean, 2 people in the land of 1.2 billion catching anything. I mean, you know, it's like saying don't travel to America because Manuel Castells has a cold. You know, come on.
I think Professor Nick Cole was next, and then...
I want to build on what Manuel was saying and try and direct you into the operational problems of conducting public diplomacy. Until 2005, I was based in the United Kingdom, and the practitioners of Indian public diplomacy in the UK were not necessarily the Indian government. A lot of leaflets that you would see introducing India, maybe reaching out about Indian culture to people of the Indian diaspora. When you looked in the back and said, well, who put this out? It would say, to learn more about India, please contact the RSS. Now, this is the equivalent would be if you were looking at a leaflet about the United States, and it would say, please contact the John Birch Society or something. This is Indian cultural diplomacy being used as the soft power aspect of extremism. But how does India combat this? How do you challenge the ability of Indian political organizations and non-governmental organizations with specific agendas presenting themselves as the authentic voice of India and reaching out to the Indian diaspora in a sort of auction of extremity? And this happens, I think, in many, many countries, for many cultures, where if you want to, you appeal to the diaspora through extremism, and sometimes extremism lives among the diaspora, seeking to show their authenticity, give themselves an identity by believing the most extreme things that are out there. But so my question is, given this situation, how do you deal with that? How can you combat that? How can you, if you were Indian ambassador in the UK, how would you?
First of all, you're right about expatriate extremism. It's a widespread phenomenon, from the Irish giving money to the IRA, to the Basques, to Ogadenis, if you like. I mean, there's so many groups which have sadly financed extremism in their homeland, and it goes to the heart of a sort of syndrome where the expatriate partly blames himself for having left his homeland, partly blames his homeland for having made him leave, and believes that if you can fix some real and imaginary ills in that homeland by supporting extremism from home, he will actually be righting the wrongs that caused him to leave in the first place. I'm being very simplistic. I have an essay on this as part of India from Midnight to the Millennium. And it's really a genuine problem. It's one which, of course, embassies around the world try and combat, just as the Irish or the British were trying to explain to Americans that their money given to jolly men in green was actually going to finance bombs and Herods. Similarly, Indian diplomats have to, or had to, it's much less of that now, but they had to do it at the time of the Khalistan movement, or the Sri Lankans were doing it for the Tamil movement, and so on. But having said that, in some ways the RSS putting forward a view like this could as well be seen as one more manifestation of the wonderful democratic diversity of India. You will find Indian Muslim groups putting out their materials. You'll find Indian Sikh groups doing it. Indians are notoriously, notorious proliferators of cultural groups abroad. And in fact, there probably isn't a town in the world which doesn't have a multiplicity of Indian cultural organizations, often divided not by religion so much as by region. You'll find a Kerala Samajam, or a Punjabi Sabha, or a Gujarati society, or whatever, in lots of towns in America. And that's to some degree normal. It's people congregating to speak a language they find familiar, eat foods they find familiar, share cultural experience they find familiar. And yes, sometimes it takes a less savory note of religious extremism or the advocacy of a particularly biased point of view. But part of the job of public diplomacy and cultural diplomacy is to counteract that. The RSS may be circulating these things in London, but when Ken Livingstone had his big festival of India on the Thames and the estuary and so on, it was one that was done in cooperation with the Indian Embassy, the Indian Council on Cultural Relations, the Government of India, and so on. And so you got a much more diverse view of Indian culture than the RSS would choose to peddle. And the same would apply to many of the other things. We have a Nehru Centre in London, which showcases much of India's cultural, intellectual, political, and other diversity through the speakers, the works of art, the performances that it showcases.
The problem isn't London. The problem's Milton Keynes.
Oh, of course, or Bradford.
Yeah, it's the provincial places where these movements are the strongest.
That's right. And of course, the government resources are limited, and that's why, to some degree, as I argue, you get it right at home, and people see what you are from their normal perception that was not mediated through the RSS or the Government of India, but just what they see in the newspapers or on TV or in Slumdog Millionaire. That gives them a different view of what kind of country you are.
As you continue to write, and as you stand for Parliament in the near future, what are the two major issues that you would like to address now? You can turn off the tape so you're not quoted in Kerala or in the Indian press, but seriously.
It's an electoral campaign.
No, I'm not yet in an election campaign, though I could be in a few days' time. Now, obviously, I mean, for me, the big issues are the development of the country, which is to overcome the horrendous blight of poverty and hunger by a whole series of actions across the board, which the present government has begun to make, and that's why I'm prepared to support them. I was critical of earlier Congress governments, but I think they're doing the right things, and we need to do them. And the second is the preservation of our democratic diversity, which is under threat from assorted fringe groups that need to be resisted. That includes, by the way, things like this ridiculous assault on women in pubs. I mean, there's this whole business of people trying to define Indianness down until it ceases to be authentically Indian. And if it's not resisted with courage in the political space and the public space, it could seriously undermine the kind of society we are. So those two, economic growth and development, the ending of poverty on the one hand, which includes everything, healthcare, sanitation, you name it, infrastructure, all of that. And the other is the preservation of our democratic diversity and pluralism as a society and as a state.
I wanted to recognise Mrs. John, who is Vice Consul at the South African Consul General. So please.
Nice to see you.
Thank you. I would like to actually comment Dr. Shashi for the very comprehensive presentation. And I want to say that for having to acknowledge the contradictions of what you refer to as paradoxes, because this is actually a feature with all European countries. And it is for me, I have learned that it is so important, those things that you mentioned as constitutional soft power that makes India to be what it is today, are the things that we normally take for granted. And yet they are the things that makes our country.
Exactly.
Even not because it all depends on the standard, the ruling, the measurement that you use. But for us, people who belong to these countries, now I understand why South Africa is actually in a collateral argument with IPSA,
Right.
India,
Brazil and
South Africa. It's because it's also characterized as an emerging power. And the way we have got so many similarities. And I was just marveling as I'm sitting here and then saying, wow. But I have learned that our soft power is what we should actually put it out as a flag. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I agree with that completely. In fact, your BRIC series should be a BRIC-SAR series. We should have South Africa in it too.
Next series. I think Professor Jeff Cowan was next on the list, and then
Shashi, I thought your talk was wonderful. It was, of course, about how India presents itself and is presented and exists in the world. I want to ask you about your public diplomacy as it relates to your neighborhood, and particularly Pakistan. What's the image in Pakistan of India? What do you hope to be able to have the image be in Pakistan? And how does one deal with that in terms of public diplomacy?
Right. Well, Pakistan has a particular problem because it essentially has been an artificial creation that has essentially defined its existence in terms of being not India. So, for example, when you go, as I've done, to the big exhibit of the origins of Pakistani culture, a place called Lok Virsa just outside Islamabad, they'll have different halls showing the influences in Pakistani culture of every single part of the planet practically, except India, which is in fact the fount of their culture. So this is part of the fundamental problem they have. So at the official level it is, and of course they ban the import of Indian books, Indian movies, Indian music, all of which are routinely smuggled in. In fact, my best guess of how most average Pakistanis see Indians came from meeting Pakistanis in America. When I first came here as a student, I was astonished at the young Pakistanis I met at university in the Boston area, who all had seen more Bollywood movies than I had, in every single case illegally, all smuggled into Pakistan, into little surreptitious movie theaters that they were watching in the 70s. Now, of course, with video and DVD, it's all over the place. They listen to Indian music in their music systems. And of course, our cuisine and our costumes are pretty much the same, so that they didn't necessarily give India credit for, but certainly music and films they did. And this is something which is quite interesting. Today, for example, Pakistani novelists in English, it's a mark of their having arrived that they get published in India. And they seek and welcome the Indian readership they get in that way. So there is, I think, at the level of the ordinary person, a tremendous interest in India as a place which they feel they can identify with, that they find familiar, that they find attractive on a purely cultural level across the board. But as I said, I speak from the very inadequate sampling of Pakistani opinion as gleaned from Pakistani expatriates. But I suspect that if we were to look in more classic senses, the diplomatic and political challenge that India faces with Pakistan is so severe, and the official relations are so unpleasant, that there are some real difficulties in getting that across in an official way. One odd thing, for example, is that India has extended most favored nation trading status to Pakistan, despite all the hostility, and Pakistan has refused to reciprocate. It's the only example in the world of a non-reciprocal most favored nation trading status. But that's also part of the thing. Pakistan says we can't have normal relations with India, and India says let's have normal relations, put our disputes on the back burner. The more we exchange people and tourism and traffic and trade, the more we'll be able to overcome our bigger problems. And Pakistan says that's exactly what we're afraid of. We don't want those bigger problems to go away, so therefore we will not promote these normal contacts. In those circumstances, public diplomacy in any meaningful sense is impossible.
Is a nuclear war thinkable?
anything is thinkable. Is it likely? Probably not. But I mean, unfortunately, in India, the state has an army. In Pakistan, the army has a state. And depending on which elements of the army come on top of that state and control it, either from behind, as they're doing now, or by directly ruling, as they've done for the majority of the years of Pakistan's existence, anything is possible. I mean, Pakistan has once had a military dictator who was a certified alcoholic, who was drunk by 11 o'clock in the morning. Thank God he didn't have a finger on the nuclear button. What might have he did launch a war on the 3rd of December 1971, a war that his country lost. Well, might someone like that again come to power in Pakistan, do it again? I don't know. The American media tells us that the US has ensured that the launch codes are sufficiently scrambled and protected that it can't be done. So I'd like to be. India has said it will never use nuclear weapons first against anybody in any circumstance. Pakistan has refused to say that because they feel the nuclear capacity is the one thing that gives them an equalizer against India's conventional superiority. So that's the big worry. But at this stage, I would say not very likely.
Could you introduce yourself? I don't think we've met.
My name is Anand, low-income student at the journalism school here. My question is about Pakistan only. Are you happy with the way India responded after Mumbai attacks to Pakistan, the whole dossier and all of that?
Yeah. Actually, I mean, I was in India just at the time of 26/11, and I was one of the first and for a while the only voice really on our somewhat hysterical television shows counseling against the immediate call for military action that was going around the place. Everyone was talking rather fatuously of surgical strikes and limited missiles and all of this nonsense. And I said that's exactly what we should not do, because that would be exactly what the terrorists want us to do. What the terrorists wanted was to provoke a military reaction from India for their own purposes. It would have immediately eased the pressure on them in Pakistan. It would have enabled them to bring all public opinion rallying under the national flag, as would happen if there's an attack from a foreign country, namely us. It would have eased the heat on them domestically, and it would have enabled the Pakistani army, which is fighting an unpopular war on the western frontier against these people and their sort of intellectual forebears, to move their troops against the more familiar enemy, us, all of which would have played right into the hands of the people who ordered and perpetrated this attack. So I'm very glad that India chose instead a tough-minded diplomatic approach, which consisted both of public pressure on Pakistan, but also of targeted diplomatic pressure through America. Because America has given $11 billion in military assistance since 9/11 to the Pakistani military, some of which has been sent, all of which was intended to fight terror. Much of it has been spent in shoring up the forces of terror coming out of there. And America, therefore, has an accounting to do, and they've begun doing it very effectively from what I've seen. And that's why we've seen some of the reluctant progress that Pakistan has made in admitting and going beyond the denial stage and admitting its responsibility for what happened, and then going on, as you know, to doing something about arresting some of the people who lead the agencies that are believed to be behind the perpetrators of this. Having said all of that, I still don't know if there's another attack, as there almost certainly will be. I'm convinced another attack is being planned during the lead up to the Indian elections. If there is another attack, and if we don't nip it early enough in the bud so it becomes as spectacular an attack as Mumbai was, I think all bets are off. I think it'll be politically very difficult for any incumbent government not to take a military response, simply because the voters would demand it. And I fear that it would be not in our interest, and yet we'd be forced to do it.
I think we can get in 2 or 3 more quick questions. So you've been very patient at the back. If you could introduce yourself to us.
Throughout your talk, you've spoken a lot about India reaping the benefits of being a multicultural nation. And for a very long time, we have reaped the benefits of our unity from our diversity. And it's just that over the past 1 decade, rather than expending energy and resources or resolving the secular issue, I believe we have a lot more issues within the nation itself, between Marathis and the Biharis, and making more states within the nation itself. So don't you think in more than one way we're taking a step behind, that we are utilizing our energy in order to resolve such secular issues and also more national issues?
Look, in a democracy, this is an ongoing process. I think there will always be contention over these various issues. But, it's the great advantage we have, that we have this built-in sort of valve on the pressure cooker. Whereas in a different sort of society, these tensions could have resulted in violence, in a breakup of the state. In India, they all get contained because there are ways out of this. You know, you agitate, you demand your rights, you may get them, you may not get them, the courts come in, you win an election, whatever it may be, and you move on. It's sort of the great ability, if you like, of the Indian limousine of state to sort of go across potholes and road bumps and shock absorbers and still carry on. Unlike, say, the Chinese state, which is like a sort of fast-moving vehicle on cruise control, with no problems at all, but we have no idea what will happen if they actually do hit a speed bump or they do hit a pothole. The entire axle might break because they don't have any mechanisms to diffuse these tensions. We do. So you're right that there is all of this. In fact, I think that we'll be finding new and more creative solutions in the years ahead. I'm not even sure that a country which when I was a kid was 14 states and is now 30 states mightn't end up being 50 states sometime. And some of our states are unworkably large. Uttar Pradesh is an example. 200 million people. I mean, it's at that level almost ungovernable. So you're going to have more and more changes, and they're going to be accommodated within the constitutional framework. But through a democratic process of interest group bargaining, judicial review, media pressure, NGO action, all of that stuff. And I think that's the stuff of what the democracy is made of. It never will be a smoothly efficient China-style state, but I think it'll endure all the more for that reason.
Sir.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. I'm curious as to whether you can offer any commentary on the recent success of the Bollywood film product in our Academy Awards. I think many Americans who had never been exposed to any Bollywood were quite taken by the smashing success in the Oscars of Slumdog Millionaires, and yet to those who paid attention to the news coverage, we saw lots of articles in the Los Angeles Times about the controversy within India over this movie. And I think it's kind of an interesting paradox. My daughter loved the movie so much that now she wants to go to India. Just to find that there, I don't know. But when I told her about the controversy, she was totally puzzled by it. And so what can I take home to tell my daughter about this?
Okay, well, plenty of things. First of all, it isn't a Bollywood movie. A Bollywood movie would be in Hindi, not in English. 1/3 of it was in Hindi, of course. And would have lots more songs and dances. And this one just had one. And it wasn't even a spectacular dance by Bollywood standards today. So in that sense, it really was, though it's a movie set in India with Indian actors and an Indian storyline based on a novel by an Indian friend of mine, an Indian diplomat, it's still screenwritten by a Brit and directed by a Brit. And that sensibility, the cinematic idiom is not a Bollywood idiom, which is why it was so accessible to the rest of the world. If you look at the Bollywood movies that have tried to get on the international consciousness, it works very well, as I described earlier in my talk, South-South. Arabs and Africans can relate to the cinematic idiom of Bollywood. The Western sensibility gets fairly impatient with it. It becomes very much a fringe taste. Though I think Bollywood's getting better at it and more Westerners are discovering it, and I would recommend a dozen Bollywood movies that I think you folks can see without being totally thrown off your normal cinema viewing patterns. That was point number one. Point number two is that in fact the success of the film does point, however, to a certain kind of Bollywood spirit, if you like. Not so much a cinematic sensibility, but a human sensibility. This encapsulated best by the triumph at the end, of this rising above the dross and suffering to triumph. That sensibility, I think in many ways, that triumphant spirit is something which does capture people's imaginations and hearts, and that might partly contribute to a greater interest in Indian cinema. And thirdly, about your daughter going there, she should. Obviously, the film had some pretty grim cinema verite stuff at the beginning, and particularly the depictions of the slums. Those are real. I mean, these were made on handheld cameras, actually filmed in those slums. You'll never find a Bollywood filmmaker doing that. The Bollywood filmmaker would construct a perfect set, far away from, in Film City, the suburbs of Bombay, and the depiction of a poor Indian in a slum would bear no relation to the reality that's more effectively captured there. So if she wants to see that, she can go to it. But if she wants to see everything else, this really was filmed, as it were, sort of on real settings, and she might really enjoy seeing that. And through that, I hope see more of India beyond.
I think you were next. If you could just introduce yourself to us.
My name is Paras. I'm from the School of International Relations. My question is, it's building on what Anand said about Pakistan and China and Bangladesh now. all these places are creating problems for India domestically and on an international level, and in a sense stunting India's growth to what it could have been, assuming these problems weren't there. So my question is, where do you see India in the next 20 years on a domestic level and on an international scale?
Well, I think we'll simply have to rise above them. For example, the Chinese manifestly have every interest in keeping India bottled up with problems on its own backyard so that it doesn't get aspirations beyond its station. Part of our diplomacy is to assure the Chinese we have no desire to be a counterweight with them. We realize they're in a different place. They're going to be the country that strips the US of that adjective soul and soul superpower, because there will be another one. And we're not going to be competing in that state. But we are interested very much in being able to play our own role. And so far, there are a lot of complementarities with China that the private sector has been effectively exploring. We have Indian computer firms opening offices in Shanghai. We have Infosys hiring Chinese in India. We have Mahindra & Mahindra designing tractors in India, manufacturing them in China for export to America. All of this is happening, and these complementarities can reassure China. And it is already reassuring China. China overtook the US this year as India's largest trading partner. So one can say that the more we ease their anxieties about us, the less worry we need have about too much of support for insurrection on our borders and so on. They do support Pakistan, despite Pakistan's support for terrorism in India, but that's because, of course, they're also playing a geopolitical balancing game. We have to deal with Pakistan, and we have to deal with it through the combination of resources we're trying right now, including through some pretty effective action from our newfound ally in Washington. I think that is going to be very important to India. Bangladesh is much more of an immediate problem. We have a real interest in preserving Bangladeshi democracy. We've got the free election of a secular-minded, moderate woman leader in Bangladesh. We ought to do everything we can to support her. And if it means saying nasty things about her in public so she can get more support at home, we should do it, because we really have to make sure that she survives. There is a dangerous Islamist current in Bangladeshi society, which we really have to watch out for, because we will be the second victims after Bangladesh itself from this current. So those are challenges. So there are tough challenges in the neighborhood, but I think we are capable of rising to them. We have the talent, we have the ability, and now with economic growth, we have the resources to be able to handle these situations.
Now, this might have to be the last question, I'm afraid, before we retire for light refreshments outside, and there might be opportunities for others to ask questions outside. Eileen, final question.
Thank you. Speaking of women leaders, Rwanda is used, I think, very effectively. The fact that they have more women in government, 50%, than any other country in the world.
50% in Parliament.
In Parliament.
Yeah.
As part of their public diplomacy. When I traveled recently to Liberia, I saw the first
woman president.
Well, not only the first woman president, but 125 highly trained Indian police officers, yes, part of the first UN all-woman peacekeeping force in any country in the world, which I thought was very impressive. And I know that in India, in your local elections, I think in your laws you have a 30% requirement 33. That women, is it 33%? That women be, elected in those positions. Can you talk for a moment about the role of women in India politically and professionally?
True. I mean, it's a long and complicated saga, and it's one more of these paradoxes, because there was when I was a kid in the 60s, there was an international sort of psychological sort of test that was conducted in schools around the world, and a dozen countries around the world, which consisted of a riddle that the kids had to answer. And the riddle was, a man is driving with his father on the highway, and they have a serious accident. The father is seriously injured and is rushed by ambulance to hospital. He is wheeled into intensive care for a life-saving operation. 2 hours later, the doctor walks out of the intensive care unit, embraces the man, and says, my son, how could this be? Any answers here? Wants to volunteer? Sorry? Right, okay. Well, 7% of American school kids in the 1960s got that answer. Something like 70% or 60-odd% of Swedish school kids got it right. 93% of Indian kids got it right. Because we've been used to seeing women doctors. The whole notion that the mother could be the doctor was not a problem. In America, it was a huge leap of the imagination for the kids to imagine that the mother could be the doctor. And they all kept thinking maybe the father wasn't that badly injured, etc. All these silly sort of answers. And the fact is that this pointed to how India had some of the world's first women doctors graduated in the 1880s in India. We had some of the world's first women pilots. We had some of the world's first women chief executives of companies. We had one of the world's first women government leaders in Indira Gandhi. We had all of these, and women in positions of authority. I'm not, at the risk of sounding like a Hindu chauvinist, Manuel, it was not difficult for the majority of Indians to swallow, because Hindus have traditionally worshipped the female principle of the divine. I mean, goddesses and the female form of divinity has traditionally been worshipped. So there's no great difficulty in respecting women in positions of authority. And at the same time, you have the most horrendous examples of oppression of women, particularly at the lower elements of the social order, the lower classes, less educated, less knowledgeable, much more traditional, much more oppressive, women given pretty much little say in their ability to determine the terms of their own lives. This paradox continues, and it's only easing with education, first of all, but even that has not been an unqualified success, because female illiteracy is markedly higher than male illiteracy. In a country where we're roughly 62-65% literate, I would say women are only about 45-50% literate. It's mainly men. You've got some genuine problems still in rural India, and particularly in the more conservative, less educated parts of India, against women. And yet you find women in key positions. The ruler of the leader of the ruling party, the Congress party, is a woman, Sonia Gandhi. We have powerful women in every one of the other political parties who are members of parliament, who are effective people. And in the local government, that is the panchayat system, the village governance, not only are 33% of the seats reserved for women, but 50% of the headships are reserved for women. So you've got to be a woman to be a head, and it rotates. So now all of this is transforming much of India in many positive ways. I'm sure that like all the other paradoxes I mentioned, that there will be problems and the things that have to be overcome. But the general trend is in the right direction.
I think we will all be watching, reading the Times of India very closely in the next few weeks for a certain political career. But Shashi, one way or another, I think that brand India is safe, so long as people such as yourself are looking after and interested in the country. So we wish you well, and thank you very, very much for a terrific talk.